The Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos is the most comprehensive and authoritative resource on Nazi persecutory sites. It documents in narrative format some 6,000 sites across various categories of persecution, as well as 38,000 labor camps in an accompanying database. The project is based on extensive in-house research and collaboration with some 700 external contributors. And the result is a very unique global collaboration in research and scholarship that now has resulted in this empirical research project documenting the Nazi camps and ghettos across all of wartime Europe. Volume 1 in the series documents early Nazi camps and concentration camps, which includes the best known concentration camps as well as hundreds of subcamps. Volume 2 in the series moves the scholarly focus further east to German-occupied Eastern Europe and documents several 1,100 ghettos in German-occupied Europe. Volume 3 in the series documents a range of camps and ghettos operated by regimes allied to the Nazi regime. And Volume 4 documents several hundred camps operated under the auspices of the German armed forces. We're very excited for the launch of our encyclopedia series on Project MUSE, where it will be available open access in PDF and HTML format, which will allow our users to engage with this content in new ways that they have not been able to before. The entries and the volumes will be fully searchable. Users will be able to run targeted searches for specific site locations, for names, but also more qualitative searches that allow them to explore various aspects of this content and of this rich scholarship through our series.
The Mandel Center's purpose is to make sure that the field of Holocaust studies exists, is supported, and continues to move forward. We've been working on this foundational encyclopedia for decades, and now we're going to be able to make sure that it reaches scholars using a variety of methods wherever they are. That is going to introduce a whole new level of dynamism into the field, both because of these new methods, digital humanities, big data analysis, but also just bringing new people into that conversation. Our readership tended to be pretty limited to people with access to English-speaking libraries. Now, new people are going to be able to access this foundational content, and once they're in the conversation, it's going to lead it in new directions. I think when I first encountered the encyclopedia, I had no idea the number of countries that there were sites of persecution. For example, North Africa, Tunisia. I didn't know that there were sites of persecution there, and many do appear in our volumes. Understanding how this history interacts with local histories is going to move the field in new directions, and that is the whole purpose of the Mandel Center. We're an educational institution, and we are a memorial. And it is only by having factually accurate information about the persecution of the Jews and other victims of Nazism that we can properly remember them. So I'm so proud that we have this partnership that's going to allow that memory to be shared more accessibly and more widely.
The original rationale for the encyclopedia was to not only provide the scholarly backbone for future research, but also to really do a service to the general public. Many of whom among the general public were just lost in the attempt to find the places where their family members were incarcerated during the Nazi era. And that's where the planning came in. And of course, no one at the time had any idea how many camps we were looking at. There were some projects that had already started, but it really takes an institution like this one, like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, that has the long-term commitment, the staff expertise, and the material resources in terms of archival records, but also in terms of the money and the support that is devoted to just that project. None of this obviously happens fast. The fact that we've been at it for 25 years, I think, speaks for itself. So this is not an enterprise that an individual scholar could have undertaken.
When our colleagues began work on this series some 25 years ago, they really had a very limited, though, for the time, advanced understanding of the nature and the scale of Nazi persecutory sites. And obviously, over the intervening decades, that understanding has grown. And we now understand that the Nazi camp system was larger, more ubiquitous, and more visible than our colleagues could have ever known 25 years ago. And what we've also learned is that this scholarship is ongoing. The process of discovering aspects and sites of Nazi persecution is ongoing for us on this project, as well as our colleagues in the field. We are still finding evidence of new sites or categories of sites that we did not know about some 10 years ago. The availability of new research, of new scholarship, of new sources kind of creates an ongoing exploration of this phenomenon that we are trying to stay aware of and incorporate in our publication. Very recently, we discovered evidence of several dozen ghettos in German-occupied Poland that we were not aware of when we published on that type of persecutory site 10 years ago. So the discovery is ongoing, and the challenges with documenting these sites responsibly is ongoing as well.
I want to pick up on what you said about 700 researchers have contributed to this over the years. We think of an encyclopedia as sort of basic knowledge. And it's amazing how little of this was known when we started and how many people we've had to involve to create this foundational knowledge.
And its evolution over the decades, this project really reflects the evolution of the field of Holocaust studies in a way, which you can see not only by the growth of the sites that we are trying to cover, but also by the scope of the people who help us in doing that. And they come from multiple countries, particularly in Europe. And that knowledge that we now can draw on wasn't really there 20, 25 years ago. So we had very little to start with. There were pockets of established knowledge, but for many of these sites there was just nothing.
It also shows the evolution of research over that time. If you think 25 years ago when we started, printed volumes were the standard at that point for research and for work. And now we've gone through a complete information technology revolution where the way people conduct research to a large extent is through digital sources. And we had an opportunity to change from our initial idea of 7 printed volumes to a digital-based system that will allow people to search much more easily, find sites, but also search within it to find information you want to use, and also to enter it in different ways. The interactive map is going to allow people to look at regions as opposed to thinking about what site am I looking for, what region am I looking at, and what is it that I want to do, and how can I access this information differently. It's really going to meet researchers where they are in terms of how they conduct research and the information they want.
There are tools like maps where we still have to do the groundwork. So we will start with a very basic map presentation that we'll then build on to come up with something that is more attuned to the needs of our audiences. So this will develop over time incrementally, and that is also the big advantage of the digital format, that we can add to it, we can correct, we can change things over time, which just isn't possible in a print format.
For digital humanities, it is important that the information can be extracted in many different ways. People use semantic searches to try to find actual sites as opposed to places. If you think about with a PDF or a volume, you can have an index that will have hundreds of listings. If you can actually do a semantic search where you're looking for a certain site or a certain attribute, it can give you a reasonable number of hits that you can go through. Geographic coordinates for all the sites will be available. People can download it, so they can then import it into their own systems and take it another step further and do their own research and find out things and correlations that may not have occurred to us.
I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that the digital revolution has not only impacted how our audiences want and can engage with our content, but also in how we generate it, how we as scholars build this research on a really solid foundation, has really broadened our reach to a range of digital archives and archival holdings or other digital sources that we use and incorporate in the scholarship. The nature of Holocaust studies is such that it really requires a lot of regional knowledge across many areas of Europe. It requires a lot of languages to access the sources. And it used to require a lot of travel or access to physical archives. And the fact that we can now collaborate with workers or with researchers on the ground in Europe, as well as have really broad reach into the collections, into the digital collections that the USHMM archives has compiled and other archives have made available digitally, has really enriched the source base for our scholarship.
We've always known that people are interested in the Holocaust from all over the world, but one of the things that's been amazing is just what reach we could have when we moved digital. And we're starting to see the fruits of that there's scholars in many countries that we had no idea were interested in this, who reach out to us because they know that our information can be relied on. And that is one of the main goals of the Holocaust Museum as a whole, to be the reliable place to get factually accurate information. We want that out for everyone. Scholars are our main audience for this, but of course we also want to reach survivors and their families or the general public that might have heard of a camp or a ghetto and want to learn more about it. And I think there's some really touching stories of survivors finding in this resource stories about camps that they had been in that they had never read anything about before. It's the factual validation of the existence of these sites of persecution.
I think this was really one of the core missions of the project, that survivors or their families would talk about experiences during wartime and talk about sites. And they had stories, but they didn't have the history.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to provide in this series, that we compile the data, archival and otherwise, primarily from the archives here at the Holocaust Museum, which is so rich in that material. So this is not just about scholars, it's about people who have experienced persecution in these sites in one way or the other. And the spectrum is really broad, from forced laborers, often women from Eastern Europe, to Jews in ghettos, to concentration camp inmates. So that's what we're trying to address here. And it remains one of the core missions that we're trying to bring into the digital age, and that is the concern and the interest of families who were affected by this piece of history.
I would add to that, too, that in this age where information and mis or disinformation is so readily available to all of our audiences, I think it is really important that we're making a digital contribution, like you say, Lisa, of this empirical research that grounds these sites and these experiences of persecution in fact and evidence, and that becomes part or remains part of the conversation and of the information that people have at their fingertips.
And I think another thing that comes across in this encyclopedia that I've always been so struck by is how many different agencies participated in the persecution of Jews. I think that's something that everyone, not just people whose families were directly impacted by this history, but the whole world really needs to grapple with, which is just how and why could this have happened? And there's a lot of false assumptions that this was just one party or this was just one agency within the Nazi state. What comes across all of these volumes is just how many different parts of the state, how many parts of society were directly involved or saw this happening. And then in other states that worked together with the Nazis, set up their own persecution apparatus. I think if we're going to grapple with the question of why and how and what the lessons are today, we have to come to terms with that full extent of persecution. And while the encyclopedia doesn't answer that, it supplies the facts that allow scholars and the wider world to start to come up with those answers.
One of the misconceptions that we're up against, at least initially, was the idea, oh, this is all run not just by the Nazis, but by the SS. Now, it's true that Himmler's apparatus plays a large role in their system, particularly in its initial stage, but this snowballed into a massive undertaking, particularly in the course of the war, where this took on dimensions that were really unprecedented. And that ended exactly in a situation where you have entire strata of society involved, not just the state apparatus, the private enterprises of many kinds, up to the churches who were drawing workforce from forced laborers from occupied Europe. So there is a whole spectrum of involvement in terms of making this possible, and I think that's something that we need to all understand. And when we ask the question, how was it possible?
One of the things that we try to do in this series within the limitations of the encyclopedic format is to capture all these different lenses and all these different perspectives that shaped not just the persecutory site on the ground, but also how it was experienced by the inmates, by the victims, and the bystanders and observers. We are incorporating a lot of high-level official documentation to the extent that we can, but we're also integrating eyewitness testimonies or memoirs or diaries that provide a more subjective point of view on how these sites operated, what the experience and its impact were. And I think for an encyclopedia, that's a very unique and very rich narrative that we're providing within the entries of the encyclopedia, and also within the very rich and detailed source essays that we provide that allow our readers to really see, where does this information come from, how was it captured, and where can I go for further inquiry?
I think the volume that we're currently working on, volume 5, has some sites that were literally in towns that were completely visible to people that we would normally describe as bystanders, seeing this every day. As you say, not hidden away, not far from population centers. So we do need to ask the question, how did ordinary people react when we come to understand where these sites were, who was benefiting from them, or who must have had to encounter them? That's a history that's hard to grapple with.
We're very excited for the possibilities of this new digital platform to allow us to revisit our research, verify it, examine new sources or newly available sources, and potentially incorporate them into our research to ensure that the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos stays up to date and remains the authoritative resource on Nazi persecutory sites. As Lisa already alluded to, the series as a whole has been instrumental in many ways in shaping the field of Holocaust studies. And at the same time, we've tried to incorporate the new methodologies, the new research questions that the field pursues periodically, the new sources into our research to remain fully integrated into the larger conversations that are happening in the field about the Holocaust. And I think it is really wonderful to see how much high-quality research scholars in this field and in related fields are producing on a continuous basis. For us, that poses the challenge. How do we go about incorporating this, addressing the new findings, the new questions, the new answers into our scholarship in the encyclopedia? We have started a pilot about 2 years ago in which we re-examined the coverage of ghettos in a certain district in German-occupied Poland, in Lublin. And we hired a team of researchers that examined the original content, examined the original sources, verified the original pieces of information that these encyclopedia entries provided, and then took a larger step back and took a larger survey of the field and of the scholarship that had emerged since the publication of that volume more than 10 years ago. And the result has been really exciting, I think, for what the encyclopedia can be if we commit to this continuous updating, continuous improvement, and continuous review of our content, which the digital platform will allow us to do.
The digital format is giving us that opportunity to add things in as there are new discoveries. We're in an era where memory has become digital. You go to the internet to find out about the past. And this is corresponding to a time that we're losing the voices of the survivor generation. Having this resource online and accessible is so important in this moment. You know, I think a lot of people might think that with the Holocaust now being 80 years in the past, that everything is automatically known, and not understand that history is a dynamic work of digging. There are archives that we now have access to today that we didn't in the 1990s when this project was first conceived and began. That includes archives from Eastern Europe, where so many of these sites were, but it also includes archives in Western Europe and even Germany. That's why this digital format, allowing us to go back and do new research into sites we already thought we had written the entry for, is so crucial.
It's also important to note that it takes often time for this information to get digested. In a digital format, I think this is much more easy, more approachable, and also it can happen faster. One example that comes to mind is the decades it took for agencies in Germany particularly that were charged with compensating inmates in ghettos for the experiences that the prisoners and the Jews in the ghettos had. The issue was always, well, we can't find that ghetto that you claim you were in on. So the absence of awareness, not necessarily the absence of historical data, but the failure to access the information that is really relevant to a task like compensation led to people being extremely frustrated, if not impossible to claim that they were actually there, and while the agencies involved would say, no, we don't have that on our list. What we offer has been very useful for these kind of effort. It shows that it takes time for this information to get digested and to really reach the level of awareness, not just among scholars, but also a wider circle, a wider community to make a difference.
Well, I think with the wider community, one of the interesting things is that most people know a few of the big sites. They don't realize the dimensions. I mean, we bandy about numbers in terms of thousands or tens of thousands of different sites, but it's not until you look at the map of it that you see how many dots there are throughout Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Germany, everywhere. And when you start to see that, you start to realize the magnitude of the situation that volumes themselves can't really convey. And when you see that, then you start to understand just how complicated this history is and just how complex the whole system was in terms of this universe of camps and ghettos. And so I think the visualizations that we're going to be able to provide in this new digital version is going to really give people a much deeper, just visceral understanding of exactly what was happening and the fact how visible it was and how widespread it really was throughout society.
I think one of the important pieces of scholarship or foundational information that the encyclopedia facilitates is tracing paths of persecution. We know that the Nazi camp universe as a whole evolved over the course of the Nazi era, and especially during the war. We know that it grew, and it grew in complexity, and it grew in variety of the types of sites of persecution that were established during those years. And the impact on the victims of this ballooning and of this ever ongoing evolution of camps was significant. We know that a lot of victims of Nazi camp-based persecution not just entered one camp, but over the course of the war likely traveled through a series of camps in different categories of persecution. Perhaps from a forced residence, they might have been deported to a ghetto in the east. They might have moved there to a concentration camp or to a labor detachment. Forced marches toward the end of the war might have brought them back to Germany and into concentration camps there. The system itself is extremely dynamic, and the experience of the victims in it is extremely varied and extremely dynamic as well. And so by providing this factual foundational information on these sites and linking the sites to other sites in which people moved from one site to another, readers and researchers get a glimpse of just this dynamism.
We are drawing to a large degree on sources that come from the inmates of these sites. And that in many instances opens completely new vistas on what these sites were all about. If one looks at the documentation that is generated by the authorities that created these sites, this is often very anodyne, sterile, as if this was just another setting where people would be housed. But it does often not convey any sense of the real life experience of people in these camps. The misery, the hunger, the disease, the daily suffering, the exploitation, and ultimately death. And that's something where survivor testimony is extremely important. One example where we have that perhaps most obviously is with regard to prisoner of war camps for Soviet POWs in German captivity. Very few survivors. And the information we have about the deadly aspect of this part of German persecution, and we're talking about 2 million dead within the time span of 1 year of the first year of the war against the Soviet Union, it's very overwhelming when you look at these comparatively few survivors, and there's extremely little in the German documentation on that. So to bring these two source formats together really opens up an understanding as to what it means when we talk about a persecutory site.
One thing about these sites as well is that there were sites that were meant to strip the humanity from people. They were to make them numbers, and as Jürgen said earlier, to make them all criminals. And one thing by using the victims' voices and using these different documentations is that we return their humanity to them and show that they were people and just how inhumane people can be in these circumstances.
One of the things that the Encyclopedia adds to the conversation about Nazi persecution and the mechanics of persecution is by documenting the range of facilities and sites that served that purpose. I think it's a very unique and valuable way of looking at the Nazi project and Nazi regime as a whole through the sites in which they exercised their power, in which they pursued their most radical and most devastating policies in regard to racial restructuring of the continent, racial persecution, exploitation, and other purposes. And quite frankly, once we take a step back and look at a particular category of camps of persecution, we find more differences between them than we find commonalities. So when we think of ghettos, we have, for instance, a very kind of common idea of a particular part of a town, either bricked off by a wall or encased through a fence. The reality of it is that there were hundreds of smaller sites that operated very differently, that were either just a part of a street, where part of a traditional Jewish quarter of a town. There may not have been physical barriers, but there were other means of control and persecution that were exercised in this locale. And I think the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos allows us to really hone in on the individual site, but it also allows researchers and descendants of victims and survivors to take a larger step back and really appreciate the system as a whole, the nature and types of persecutions that operated very differently in very different locales, and that really are a testament to the range of suffering and persecution that the Nazis inflicted.
I think the Holocaust Museum and Project MUSE are really aligned in trying to foster scholarship by reaching scholars in new ways with the material that they need. Reaching the audiences that Project MUSE has already built is extremely exciting to us. One of the things that our museum has always had to grapple with is the question of why as well as how. And I think survivors had one perspective on that was really important. They told the story of how they suffered under Nazi persecution. The Encyclopedia project is built on research that uses those voices and those memories and puts them together with documents produced by the persecutors. And what that allows us to do in kind of weaving those together is understand what happened, how horrific these conditions were, and also what logic it played within the Nazi persecution apparatus. That the Nazis were at once trying to persecute and destroy Jews and also exploit them along the way for their labor. And that was an essential function of these camps. We can't fully answer the question of why just based on these facts, but we are laying the groundwork for new generations of researchers to come up with answers.